This is a time budgeting exercise that I've done with my students for many, many years now, and I think it's very useful in order to be able to reality check how much time you have for your studies, how much time to set aside for different assessment tasks, and to be able to understand how the amorphous set of time we have at the start of a term quickly turns into very limited time constraints. So we use a sort of a budgeting exercise, and in the same way budgets are good for those questions of where did my salary go, where did it all go, well, you break it down and you find out where you spend it on. You actually look at the way in which you allocate the time resources that you have set aside for study. And the starting point is to figure out how much time do you set aside for study. Now, the guidelines from the university say somewhere between 16 to 24 hours per week, and that's for your individual study. That's above and beyond the contact hours you might have in lectures or tutorials or whatever. And how you determine what time you actually have, it's rather than just sort of idly planning and saying, well, I think I have this amount and I'll probably try and match that each week. What you do is you actually do a weekly timetable of one of these many different sorts, and you figure out the time that you set aside every week for study. And that's rail, hail or shine, because the truth of life is that there's always going to be something in the way. There's people are going to be sick, there's all going to be other things. So one of the things about budgeting, the same way with budgeting money, is if you take it from one place, you've got to put it back from somewhere else. There's no endless bottom supply of time that at some point you'll be able to make up. And if you feel yourself into thinking that somewhere towards the end of term you're magically going to have all this extra time, that you're going to not have extra shifts at work, or your family are going to, I don't know, win the lottery and move away, it doesn't very often happen. So you need to keep to that discipline each week. Okay, so let's assume that we are not going to be too ambitious in our setting of study hours, that will go with what's generally considered to be the minimum to get by. Remembering, of course, that other people are going to be spending more time on study and are going to be able to invest more time in those outcomes. So, as I mentioned before, 16 to 24 hours per week of personal study time above and beyond your contact hours is what the university recommends. And let's just say we go for 16 hours. So we go for 16 hours. Now, how we break that down, of course, is a matter for our diary, but we might do something like this. We might go, we'll do 8 hours on Sunday. We'll have one day a week really heavily set aside. We'll spend the whole day studying. Maybe we'll do 3 hours on Tuesday evening. We can get somewhere between 8 and 11 p.m. 3 on Wednesday, and maybe 2 on Friday. Friday morning we might get a bit of a half day or something. We spend a couple of hours in the morning, and that, I believe, takes us up to 16. But of course that's how it's a matter for you to figure out how you're going to fit these things in. So when we've got 16 hours a week over 12 weeks of term, what we come up with is a grand total, a grand pool of 192 hours. Now let's, just for the sake of ease, make that 200 hours. Now, what you probably can safely do in this circumstance is probably take 10% off of your pool for hazards, sickness and other things. We probably should be working with something like 180, but we're not going to get into that kind of detail right now. But you should always allow for things to happen along the way, that you're not going to have that total amount of time. Anyway, presuming we're going to be studying 4 subjects, so we're looking at a full-time load here, and of course you modify this for whatever load you're doing. That means you have a nice easy total of 50 hours per subject per term to spend on study. And like the weekly budget, when you see it all in one place, it doesn't look too bad. But how do we allocate that? Well, you have to spend your time preparing and also working on assessment work. And there's no magic formula here, but let's say it's half and half. So you spend half your time preparing. So it's 25 hours, and that's doing all your reading, making notes, revising, keeping your notes in order, and that sort of stuff. And we spend half the time on assessment, which is another 25 hours. And this is again one of those mistakes people often make, particularly towards the end of term, is they don't keep the preparation and revision time up. And I've mentioned previously that people who often say, I'm terrible at exams, usually means it's more that they're bad at managing their time around exams. And towards the end of term, you're going to have assignments due pretty much every week. You're going to have over 4 subjects, you're going to have a lot of assessment that's due. And if you just focus on that assessment and you don't spend time keeping up that preparation work, that's when you're going to really suffer in the exams. So our pool is getting smaller and smaller all the time, as you can see. And let's say we've got 25 hours for assessment in a particular subject, and that's broken into, say, a 50% assignment. / research paper, 20% test, and a 30% exam. Now you can do this for yourself, of course, and insert all the relevant numbers and figures, but this should give you a rough idea. Now, again, quite roughly, if we break up our budget of time for this one subject, you've basically got 12 hours for your research paper, about 5 hours for the test, which would involve things like preparing, note-taking, doing hypothetical tests, doing old tests to make sure that you know how to answer them, and the same for exams. Again, this is on top of the time you've spent here in preparing and revising, but that's 8 hours of really focused work of going over old exam papers, focusing exam drills, and that sort of thing. Okay, so we're seeing we've got substantially less time for our paper. 12 hours, you think, well, that's half a day. That's not looking great, but you also have to consider that a paper is broken into parts. And again, completely arbitrarily, let's break it into 3. So the 3 aspects of research. There's the reading phase where you're researching, finding stuff, and making notes, collating, and so on. There's the writing phase where you're getting in and actually writing the material. And there's the proofing phase. Now each of these, this is the one people tend to miss, is this last one. Each of these probably should have about equal time spent on them. And again, people skimp on this stage, and this is where people often get into problems because they don't leave enough time in between the writing and proofing stage, and they certainly don't leave enough time to go to check it, go over it again, make sure it makes sense and make changes, get someone else to read it, and to work on the feedback that they give you. So, unfortunately, what we end up with here is a really small amount of time of 4 hours on each of those parts of the paper. And that's a 50% paper. That's going to be a significant component of your assessment. This is going to be substantially less if it's a 20% paper or a 30% paper. So do this exercise for yourself. But what you actually may then find is this 16 hours, which seemed like, a particularly, reasonable amount of time to be working on something, at the end of the day isn't very much. And over the course of a whole term, you don't actually end up with very much time. So this is where you might have to do some more work and think about what are the sacrifices I'm going to have to make in here to fit more study time in. Now, this isn't exactly the most happy or cheerful of tasks to go through. And as I said, I've done this for many, many years with students. But I think it's very, very important. And it's very important to overcome the start of term where you think, oh, it's 12 weeks away to the end of term, I have plenty of time, I'll be able to do this, I'll be able to do that, and to actually concretely make plans. And, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. This is where a lot of people go off the rails. If they don't keep to their budget, if they start borrowing from their study budget for other things. And I'm not saying here that people are taking time off to go and have holidays in midterm. I mean, there's all sorts of life pressures that come in here. But if, you know, a friend is having a crisis and needs you to sit down with them and help them through it, that time is not time that comes from nowhere. And if that time comes out of your study time, that's going to impact on your results. And sometimes you need to be able to make those choices in an informed way and know if you're going to lose a significant amount of time for whatever event, no matter how important, that is not an endless amount of time that you're going to be able to find somewhere else. And that's something that it's a choice for you to make, but it's a choice for you to make informed by that information. So I hope that's helpful. It may not at the end of the day give you the answer that you're hoping to get. It may be something that I know many students in the past have found this a real eye-opener and something that's been a big surprise when they've worked through the figures. But power is knowledge, and it's important to stay informed and to make sure when you make plans you're doing it from the best possible position and have the most data available to you in order to understand what's happening. And in this case, understanding how much time you have and how you spend it is a crucial thing in terms of study success.